Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm not sure where I met Bob, but I know he was at my conference the second year, I guess.
Last year, I think.
Yeah, last year. Last year was the second year.
Second.
Yep. And then I had the opportunity, speaking of reasons to believe, to meet Dr. Hugh Ross at his house when Dr. Ross came to speak there. So I won't be as brilliant as Dr. Ross, unfortunately, but who is. And so that's why I'm not going to talk about any kind of astrophysics related information today. But what I am going to talk about is a very important question, and really it's a fundamental question. Before we can even get into a lot of the deeper stuff, a lot of you, obviously if you're affiliated with Reasons to Believe, you are not new to apologetics, so this is a bit different from my typical crowds. I speak a lot with young people. Like I said, I've been in youth ministry for, how old am I? Over 15 years now. That's crazy. I know I look like I should be in youth ministry, right? Don't answer. So our young people have questions, and actually it's funny, this morning I woke up and woke my oldest daughter up. Last night I took them to the daddy-daughter dance, and then this morning I wake her up to get ready to come here, for me to get ready to come here, and she goes to the bathroom, she comes back out, and this is the first question of the day. Is God an opinion? I'm like, I'm still rubbing sleep out of my eyes. Like, I'm not ready for this right now. But the good thing is I started teaching her apologetics when she was 6. And because of the fact that teenage years is too late. And it's not to say that God can't do some amazing things he can't redeem. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we've got to start younger. The things that we were exposed to in college, they're exposed to in high school. High school now is elementary. And so he mentioned Jim Warner Wallace, who's a good friend of mine now. We're going through the book Cold Case Christianity for Kids. I'm going through it with her. She's 8. And so if you're a parent or grandparent, if you're not already being intentional about providing our kids with the evidence, not just telling them the quote-unquote stories, which I hate that terminology, of the Bible, then we're missing the boat. So what does it mean to be human? You know, there's a lot of presuppositions that are embedded in kind of the secular answer to this question. And a large part of what it means to be human is sustained in the provision that comes from our source. So what I want to do today, in the brief time that I have, is kind of walk us up to the point of where the society and where the world currently is, which, although they won't admit it, but it's in a state of hopelessness. There's a lot of hopelessness in a lot of people. And that's because if you don't have access or you're not connected to the source of all hope, there's no other choice but hopelessness. So I want to walk us to that point, but before we can get to that point, we have to establish value, because value, meaning, and hope is this kind of tripartite thing that I've kind of tried to solidify. If I ever do go PhD, it'll be in some way to prove this case. In the master's right now, I'm like, I can't see that far ahead. It's a lot of reading. So what it does seem, though, is that there's an inescapable reality that human beings are utterly and essentially unique. That's important because the secular answer to how we even got here doesn't provide access to us having inherent value. So because I can't get through everything, I want to give you kind of several lanes or avenues of evidence to think about, some of which you may have already thought about. But when we tie it all together, you know, Jim Warner Wallace is as a detective, talks a lot about the fact that most cases are circumstantial, they're cumulative. You don't have one piece of evidence to say, okay, God exists, we got it. You put all the pieces of evidence together, and then when you look at 40 pieces of evidence, if you're in a court of law and there's 40 pieces of evidence against one guy, they probably did it, right? So it's a pretty conclusive case. Now, I just finished reading this book by Nick Wolsterstoff called Reason Within the Bounds of Religion. I just want to read this quote as we start. It says, "The belief that one of the fundamental things that make human beings unique among earthlings lies in the fact that they and they alone have been graced by God with responsibilities. And that in turn presupposes that man, was created in such a way as to be free to carry out or not carry out those responsibilities. Now, that statement carries a lot of weight, which we'll try to unpack some of that, but I believe Ken Samples, who he works for Reasons to Believe or writes for them, so he has kind of these 4 categories, and I'm going to walk through these categories to set this up, and I'm going to add some more to what he wrote, at least on the blog that I read. 4 things that human beings have. Number 1, we are intellectual creatures. Most of us are. But you have to have knowledge. You have to know and utilize information. Just to get here, you had to stop at the red light. You had to look both ways. You had to do certain things just to get here. So there's a certain amount of intellect we all have, give or take. So we're capable of rational thought, reflection, intentionality. And these are things that are agreed upon. It doesn't matter, atheist, Christian, we all agree on these things. The question is what best explains those things. One issue that I see when I talk with atheists specifically, and I talk with people of all stripes, Muslim, Hindu, whoever, it's not that atheism just doesn't have, in my opinion, the best answers to the questions, is that they can't even justify asking the question. And that seems to be a more profound issue, because if the worldview won't even support the ability to ask the question legitimately, then whatever answer you provide is already flawed. So if, as Richard Dawkins says, we're just dancing to the tune of our own DNA, we've heard this, right? We're just meat computers. We're just obeying whatever our neurons or DNA tells us to do. Then how does that lead to advanced reasoning processes? And why would it only lead us to advanced reasoning processes and not everything else that's been created? And when I say advanced, I mean to the level of humanity, because there is no other species building computers, building TVs, giving talks, right? So there seems to be something fundamentally unique. Now, Michael B., he has done a lot of work in this area in one degree, and I just want to highlight a couple things to substantiate this. Now, some of us might have to think back a ways, but if you remember in science class, there was an 8-part classification system, right? Who can name it? Kingdom. Remember how we? Phylum. Okay. So it's domain, kingdom, phylum. Where's the young guys? You should know this. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Now, if we think about that 8-part as this amount of money, right? There's 8 digits here. So domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, right? So scientists have found that any kind of evolutionary process can only affect the cents column. It can only affect the tenths and the hundredths column. But here's the problem. If you can't jump from here eventually to there, you can't fulfill macroevolutionary theory. And so when they've looked at over 2 million years of intense selection after eons of the most fierce evolution, this is a quote from Michael Behe, the Finnish ancestor and descendants differ only in the pennies and dimes columns. Millions of years of selection have left the finches very, very close to where they started. So if we can't get out of genus to domain or phylum or class or order, how do you explain humanity from a purely naturalistic point of view? So part of what it means to be human is rooted in what it means not to be something else. And this is not, so the reason I set it up this way is because it's not just my opinion in that sense. When I think of the specified complexity in DNA, where it's been shown that in one amoeba, there is more information than in all 30 volumes of Encyclopedia Britannica. So if that's the case, it seems to fly in the face of logic to suggest that simple evolutionary forces could be responsible for that amalgamation of information. And furthermore, all of us have DNA. You have DNA, I have DNA, but we don't look alike, we don't talk alike. I don't think. I haven't heard you talk much today. But there's differences. And we know that in the DNA code, there's 4 letters, right? The A, C, T, and G. Adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. It's amazing what God can do with 4 letters that we can't do with 26. With 4 letters, he's created the individuals in this room, similar in many ways, but different in a lot of ways. Who else but God could we attribute that to? So let's talk a little bit more about language. Now, intellectually, we know that language is important. This is not a talk if I can't talk, right? And if I couldn't prepare the words, if I couldn't put these things together, if I couldn't type this out, if I couldn't make this for you, that all requires not just intellect, but it requires information. And there's 5 levels of information. What's his name? Dr. Werner Gitt, who's an IT specialist engineer, and he says it like this. First level is statistics. Now, if I have this keyboard here and I just sit on it and some letters come up, is this information? No. Some say yes, some say no. No? Who said yes? Said yes? I mean, it is information. It's not good information. It's not actionable information, but it's something, right? And at this... Say what? It depends on how you define the information. True. Very good point. Very good point. So according to Shannon's theory, any random sequence of symbols is regarded as information without regard to its origin. And so at this level, it is maybe not. Like the fact that we have a debate says a lot about it, right? Cosyntax is the second level. Let's learn kids paste. I know it's a little cut off there. And actually another level of statistics is actually even simple patterns. This is information as well. Is it actionable information? Maybe, maybe not. We have to figure out what that was trying to communicate. But at cosyntax, this second level, we have codes, we have rules for governing the way the symbols are assembled. But grammar and vocabulary is still at this point independent of meaning. Okay? Now, semantics, this is from the Greek word semantikos. It means characteristic, significance, aspect of meaning. So let's learn to paste. That is a sentence. We can understand it. There is some meaning. We don't know exactly who we're talking to or what the request is yet, but this is a cogent level of information. Pragmatics is next. At pragmatics, it says, let's learn to cut and paste, kids. So now we have information communicated with a response sought out. So we're communicating and we're expecting a response back. And apologetics is another level after that, which is slightly higher than pragmatics, but it's from the Greek word apobenon, which means result, success, or conclusion. Now at this level, the sender communicates information and what result they want back, but also there's a purpose behind it. There's a deeper meaning or a deeper level behind it. Now this simple sentence doesn't really allow us to delve into the depth of the statement. But I want you to understand something. DNA is information at this level. Now, if it was at the basic level, we could say maybe natural processes could produce that. But who of anybody, regardless of worldview, would think that natural processes, time plus matter plus chance, could produce information at that level? Furthermore, let's say it like this. We know that the information is at a high level because changing one thing changes the whole meaning of the statement. Does anybody see the flaw here in the sentence? With no comma, that's a very horrifying sentence. Let's learn to cut and paste, kids. Right? Changing one letter in a genome changes everything. So when information is communicated at this level, the details matter. And if we're going to assume, or if the assumption is that God did not put these things in play, did not write this information intelligently, then we're assuming that it happened on its own. How would we assume that it would happen to this degree of complexity? But that's what we're left with if we take God out of the picture. Let me take it another step. Let's say you're walking on the beach. Early in the morning, you want to go for a nice walk on the beach by yourself. There's no one there. And 6 in the morning, you're walking on the beach, and you see in the middle of the sand, John loves Sarah. And it has the heart with the arrow and all that. Would you assume that a wave washed onto the shore and wrote that sentence? Or would you assume that that message is the result of a mind? Whenever we see information, whenever we hear, read, or interpret messages, we always intuitively think and know that it is the process of a mind or a product of a mind of a messenger. Messages come from messengers. So you and I have within us the most complex system of messages ever created. Why would we not also think that that is the result of the most complex mind ever to live? In fact, former Antony Flew, who you might have heard of, he was the most prominent atheistic philosopher of the 20th century. Debated Gary Habermas, and I think in Rabbi Zacharias in college he talks about having to deal with him. He said, what I think the DNA evidence material has done is that it has shown by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life, that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinary diverse elements to work together. Now, we don't know for a fact that he went all the way to Christianity, but he became, I guess, what you would call a deist, at least, before he passed. But at least he was willing to say, you know what, I've been arguing for this atheism my whole life, but I just can't get past this. This seems too specific to be accidental. And I think he was onto something. See, when we see complex messages, we should actually more naturally assume a complex mind. And I would also submit to you this, that it is our relationship with that messenger that gives our lives true meaning. And the absence of that produces hopelessness, often. Number 2, we are moral creatures. I could spend the whole day on this. Obviously, I don't have that kind of time. If you have other questions, we can talk during Q&A. The issue is not, do you have to know God to be good or do good things? The issue is that the thing that we call goodness cannot exist if God himself does not exist. And so when we talk about, let's say, the problem of evil, people have often tried to use this as a knock against Christianity, but here's the thing, everything exists through its opposite when we're talking about objective values. So if evil is objectively a real entity, a real thing, it is actually in essence the aberration of the perfection which is good. So like C.S. Lewis said, the shadow proves the sunshine. You can have a person with no shadow if there's no light on them, but you can never have the shadow with no light. Evil is good gone bad. Make sense? If you have a car and it's rusty, you take the rust out of the car, you have a better car. You take the car out of the rust, you have nothing. Doesn't work, right? So if evil exists, which we all would agree it does, then that means good exists. But if good exists, to what do we ascribe that level of goodness? To what do we attach the standard for goodness? Even Richard Dawkins has, and this is not even the most troubling thing he said in regards to this, but I actually give him credit because at least he's honest with his worldview and where it logically takes us. Another quote I didn't put here today where he says, you know, to decide whether what Hitler did was wrong is actually a very genuinely difficult question. Is it? Now, at least he's being honest because if there's no God, then morality is just a subjective idea. It's an opinion. And if that's an opinion, then it doesn't actually exist in objectivity. So in his book, I think this was Outgrowing God, he alludes to the fact that maybe God could help people be better he put it like, if he feels like they're being watched, we feel like we're being watched. And that was his way of kind of wiggling into that space without going all the way. But people may feel free to do bad things because they feel God is no longer watching them. He said, I'd like to believe I'm honest whether anyone is watching or not. But I think he knows that that's not possible. And it's not just not possible for him, for any of us. Let's skip that for now. We are aesthetic creatures. There's a uniqueness in our ability to imagine. There's a uniqueness in our ability to create. Like I said, I forget who it was. I was watching a talk, and he said, well, how do you know the whole monkey to man debate? He said, well, when I go to the zoo, I'm always on the outside of the cage. I think sometimes we overthink these things. But we have the ability to appreciate beauty in art, in architecture, in people. if you're married, it started that way. Usually it starts that way. There's a brilliant clip of William Lane Craig in a debate, and the guy asks about, what science can't tell us. And science, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of truths that we consider to be true that science can't tell us. Aesthetic truths, moral truths, as we just went over, ethical truths. It's not just, the scientists can do their experiment, but what tells them to be honest about it? Metaphysical truths, the fact that I'm aware that there are other minds other than my mind, even though I'm not in your mind. Science itself can't be explained scientifically. You ever think about that? Spiritual creatures. We were having in our Wednesday so we just started a house church, so we meet on Sundays at this gentleman's house and Wednesdays at my house, and we were talking about the fact that, and because I talk to people of so many different worldviews, and the whole thing that's popular right now is I'm just spiritual, I'm just spiritual. I don't know what the heck that means. It's not attached to any faith or religion, which that's fine if that's what they want to, but there's something in us, Calvin would call it the sensus divinitus, and that there's some sort of sense in us that there's something we're drawn to. C.S. Lewis said, if I find in myself a longing for which nothing in this world can satisfy, maybe it means that I'm meant for another world. What is that longing? Some people search their whole life and they go through a lot of different dynamics to figure out how to fulfill that longing. And it's my assertion, I believe most of our assertion, that only God can fill that. And so the fact that we are in some sense a spiritual creature, I believe atheists may not affirm it, they'll affirm it in a different way. But there's some sort of meaning that we're looking for. There's something outside of ourselves that we're trying to make sense of this life through. There's some paradigm we're trying to navigate to be able to figure this thing out. Now, I want to delve a little bit more into this kind of the scientific foundation for humanity or for human beings and for what it means to be human. When we think about specifically naturalism and theism, we have to wrap our brains around the debate between the brain and the mind. Sharon Derricks, who is a speaker for RZIM and actually just released a book last year called Am I Just My Brain? Spoiler alert, no, you're not. But the debate is this, because look, if we're just natural, fleshly, beings, then we are just our brain. It is true that we're just dancing to the tune of our own DNA. But if that's true, how can you even trust your own reasoning? And if that's true, how can we ever hold anybody accountable for what they do? Because they didn't decide to do it. Their DNA just told them to do it. They're predisposed to it. But none of us could live in a society like that. It's unlivable. So we can say moral standards are needed to be pragmatic in the sustainment of the human race. Okay, but that's still not objective. So there's a guy, Ed Fraser, said, he was writing and he quoted a famous Confucian proverb that says, when the finger points at the moon, the idiot looks at the finger. In fact, the material world points beyond itself to God, but the secularist sees only the material world. The material side of human nature points beyond itself to an immaterial and immortal soul. The secularist sees only the brain and the body. The sexual act points beyond itself to marriage and family. The secularist sees only the sexual act, so on and so on and so on. What else can I say? It's the moon, stupid. I didn't say it. When I do something for my wife, and like I said, I told you I took my girls to, I'll give you a moment, to the daddy-daughter dance yesterday. Why? I came home from work, I was home for 10 minutes, changed, and got ready and took them. Because I'm not doing something purely out of my DNA making me do something. It's out of a sense of love. How do we reduce love to a purely natural process? Why do I want to make them smile? Why do I want to, I was telling my wife yesterday when I got home, I was like, having 3 women that's a lot for one guy. So me and her going out tonight, me and my wife. So how do you explain this purely scientifically? How do you explain these feelings? Because there's an existential, almost an empirical component. Now, I know we can't empirically verify love. And I've been with my wife at this point half our lives. I've been married for 11 years, going on 12. And the love is there, and I believe she loves me, but I'm not in her body, I'm not in her brain. So really, I don't know to what extent my perception of her love for me is the same way that she's perceiving it. I hope it's the same. But if we're just a cosmic accident, if we're just meat computers, how can you trust your moral reasoning? How can you trust the love you feel? How can you trust your reasoning in general? And let's go back to science. Every science brings to the equation certain presuppositions. They bring a worldview. They bring, like Mike Lacan would call a horizon. When we talk about historical research, there is a certain level of biases that we all have. We're humans. We have life experiences that teach us to view life a certain way. Some right, some wrong. Some out of protection. Some out of learned behaviors. Good learn and bad learn. But every scientist brings to the scientific process certain presuppositions and biases. Now, think about this. Every scientist who believes that only the natural or material world has something to say to us does so while being conscious. But they cannot explain their consciousness purely scientifically. So science can explain how the scientist is able to do science. We think about that? And I'm not saying that obviously that means everything is invalid. As hopefully is probably evident, I love talking about science. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's one piece to the puzzle. And to reduce it to the totality of all the evidence that we need or have, I think is presumptuous. So, what it means to be human has to incorporate some immaterial realities, namely the mind. There are certain metaphysical realities that can't be reduced to purely data-driven evidence, scientific evidence. And if that's the case, then we've already exited materialism. And if we're outside of the realm of materialism, we're in an immaterial environment. And if that's the case, that subverts naturalism, at least to a degree. Furthermore, when we're talking about what it means to be human, scientists have also seen that there is a certain amount of goal-directedness in species. Now, I had a dog. We had to put him down a couple years ago, unfortunately. Well, before I say that, let me show you this. So there's a scripture in Genesis 1. It says, "And God said, let the earth bring forth creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so, and God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, livestock according to their kinds, everything that creeps on the ground according to its kinds." A few verses later, God creates man in his image, according to God's kind, in essence at least. So God set up this plan in a certain way that everything would have a plan built into it. So back to my dog. We brought him home. He was 2.5 months old. We did not bring his parents home with him. But when we brought him home, he knew how to be a dog. He barked like a dog. He ate like a dog. He peed like a dog, often in the house. And we didn't have to teach him how to be a dog, nor could we, because we're not. So there seems to be a plan built into certain species. So let's go back to that chart we looked at, the eight-part classification system. The species, the genus, even really up to domain, has certain plan types built into them that seem to be, for the species, that they cannot exit those things. With me? So we saw this with DNA. Scientists have even tried to manually manipulate to see if we can jump class, species, and those things. So this fruit fly, they tried to genetically manipulate, and they just made a jacked up fruit fly. We probably had like one long wing, one short wing. It was probably flying in circles, but it was still a fruit fly. They can't get something to be a dog and go to a cat. And in the same way, humans seem to be utterly and essentially unique. And so, if it's the case that genetic limits do exist, which they seem to exist, then they keep things locked into their basic type. But Darwinists, as we know, believe that short changes over a small period of time would indicate large changes over a large period of time. I actually have a quote from Origin of Species. I didn't put it up here, but Darwin gave a way out of his own theory that really speaks to the fact that we shouldn't even be teaching macroevolutionary theory anymore to our kids. But he says in his own Origin of Species, I believe, I used to know the page number, I forgot now, but he said if it could be shown that any process could not be the result of successive smaller processes, then my theory would absolutely break down. We now know that there are many things that cannot be what's called irreducibly, that are irreducibly complex, namely the cell, which you have millions of in your body. The cell itself, one cell, is irreducibly complex. Irreducibly complex means that if all the parts in it are not working together at the same time at the beginning, then it can't go to it can't evolve because it's not viable to evolve. On a very simple, this is kind of a sophomore level of understanding, but just think about this. If somebody says you have your circulatory system, your respiratory system, which one came first? I actually used to have a chicken and egg picture because that's a good one. Which one comes first? Your respiratory system needs blood. Your circulatory system needs oxygen. If they're not both there at the beginning, there is no evolution because you're not alive. You spoke of chicken and egg. What I usually have is a protein molecule because protein molecules are manufactured in these cellular factories called ribosomes. But ribosomes are composed of protein. Chicken and egg. You see the problem? So when we talk about certain things like this, and this is back to what Michael Behe has discovered. Now, if we go to those scientists in the lab with the fruit fly, we have intelligent minds, seemingly, in the lab trying to manipulate the process and can't. So why would we assume that unintelligent, involuntary, natural forces could produce molecules to man evolution? So what it means to be human is something that is utterly unique. What you would actually need is a more intelligent mind. You'd need the most intelligent mind. And so what it means to be human is therefore that we are locked into being exactly what God created us to be. And not understanding what it means to be human in an essential way, in an objective way, will often lead to hopelessness. Now, I'm not saying every atheist walks around in a woe is me fashion. They don't, and I know many. And actually, probably the biggest issue or the hardest one for me to talk to is what is quote unquote the happy atheist. The one that's not searching, they're content, they got some money, they got some things they like to do, some things they care about. Life's pretty good. How do you reach that one? But if we were able to really be in their head, and I'll tell you very, very quickly, I don't have the time to go into testimony, but you can actually watch the entire testimony video on my YouTube page. When I met my wife in college, she was an atheist. Now, I wasn't a great Christian, so don't there's a lot more to that story. But the way she got saved was kind of miraculous, and I think some people need that. She wasn't going to just come on Sunday morning and be like, oh yeah, let me do this. But she said, when she did get saved, she said, and I remember this, she said, I felt like a weight had been taken off my shoulder that I never knew was there. See, the happy atheist is only happy because they haven't experienced true freedom. And what we have to be able to do, slowly but surely through the relationships we build, and I hope we are building relationships with people who don't think like us, is begin to drop bits and pieces of God's truth, the truth, so that they can begin to be open to their own assumptions, because they're making a lot of them. I always say, when we're talking with atheists, at some point, they're going to make a self-refuting statement. You just got to catch it. At some point, it's going to happen. You just go, but if that's true, how is this true, right? There is no truth. Is that true, right? Have you ever heard Frank Turek say that? So those types of statements that will come out are some things that we need to be aware of. And it's not to be like a gotcha moment, but it's just to hopefully be evangelistic in that moment. Amen? So let's talk about some philosophical foundations for humanity before we wrap up. Now, in the same vein as that mind versus brain question, the other question is the soul. Is there a soul? Do we have a soul? Are we a soul? There's a Christian answer. And I think getting to the point that we see that there are some immaterial realities to who we are. And that says, okay, well, maybe the door is open for this soul thing being a reality, right? Because if there is no immaterial reality, there is no soul. And so atheists will obviously say there is no soul. Now let's think this through. If you are you, what's your name? David. Okay. David is David. He's been David all his life. Regardless of the changes that he experiences, he's always David. David Fisher, more specifically. Now, watch what I'm saying. Natural or material objects do not maintain identity through change. Let's look at this car. Let's say you want to replace all the parts on this car. And then you're going to take the old parts from this car and put them on a new car, and then put new parts on the car. So first you take a wheel off, take another wheel off, take the door off. You keep going until you have essentially two cars, I should say. This is not a better version of that car. You just have a new car. Material objects do not maintain identity through change. Now, if you go to war or something, come home and you have to get a leg amputation, you are still you. How is that possible? How is it possible that you can have a heart transplant, a new this, a new that, but you are still you? People will still say, hey, remember when we grew up together and we did this? What is it, the part about you that stays the same that allows that to be true? Because if you're just material, if you're just flesh, then every time something on your flesh changes, you change. Did you know that every 7 to 10 years, every cell in your body is replaced? So depending on your age, you're literally a new person multiple times in your life, physically. But no one says, hey, what's your name again? Every 7 to 10 years. I hope. I mean, then we got to test them for something else. Even twin babies, utterly unique on a molecular level, even in a personality level. And I know, you might not be able to tell them apart when you look at them, but God can. There is a clear difference. And so if material, natural things don't maintain identity through change, and you and I do, it seems to me inescapable of how you can explain that outside of a theistic framework. Let's talk about one more part of this. There are degreed and non-degreed properties. So let me give you an example. Something can be loud, something can be quiet. There are degrees of volume. Make sense? Something can be hard, something can be soft. There are degrees of strength or toughness or whatever you want, density, whatever term you want to use, right? Then there are non-degreed properties. 2 and 4 are both even numbers, but 4 is not more even than 2. 1 is not more odd than 3. Okay? So here's why this matters. Because what makes you human? Can you be more human than another person? If it's just natural, then the more mass, the more matter you have, the bigger you are, the more human you are. Does that sound right? Actually, everything that we read is telling you how to lose weight. So you want me to be less human now? Does that make sense? No, because we all know intuitively that your humanity is not tied to your size. There are no degrees of humanity. In fact, even the people, the atheists who argue for their rights as humans, are doing so without realizing that the thing that makes you human, you have not acknowledged yet. It's not the fact that you just get to say I have rights. Why do you get to say you have rights? What makes you in a class called humanity that is endowed with certain inalienable rights? What gives you that status? Who gives you that status? Our soul. Because if personhood, or if being human is a non-degreed property, if it's a static assessment of your value, then it has to be rooted in something non-physical. It has to be rooted in something transcendent. It has to be rooted in something that can't simply be tied to your physical body. And if that's the case, the only thing that fits that mold to me is your soul. And if there's a soul, then we're another step to the way. Like I said, we're building a case that the Bible is pretty accurate. It's an understatement, I know. So there's immaterial realities to who we are. And if you think about the goal-directedness, an acorn always becomes an oak tree. It doesn't choose to become an oak tree. And it can't choose to become something else. So if there's a goal, if there's a direction built into us, like I said, I never had to teach my dog how to be a dog, but I had to teach my kids how to do everything. We had to teach them how to eat, what not to eat. You have to teach your kid how to sleep. In fact, if you don't sleep train your child, you will never get sleep. Do you think about these things? Do other people think about these things, I should say? Human babies have to be taught everything. And not that other species don't have to be taught, but the range of information that we need as humans is vastly different. Now, I developed a sort of logical proposition. It's not quite a syllogism, but I want to walk you through this to give us one more piece of evidence. But pay attention to the screen. Because if naturalism is true, it's not far off. If naturalism and atheism are true, then there is no meaning to life. You might as well play more Xbox. You're just biding your time until you get to the grave anyway. Have fun, die young. But if it's not true, and there is meaning in life, then how do we assess that, and how do we arrive at that? They said at the beginning, I write a blog called Relentless Pursuit of Purpose. I'll put the stuff up at the end, and I would hope everybody can subscribe. It just comes to your email. I used to do it every week, but now I'm in school, and I got to read 300 pages a week, so I do it a couple times a month. But I do a lot of apologetic writing, and sometimes I write a blog. I guest write for Cross Examine, their blog as well, and some other people as well. But we'll talk about that later. So look, I talked at the beginning that I wanted to build the case to set up what I'm about to say right now, which is that without value, there's no meaning. Without meaning, there's no hope. Okay, this is the tripartite thing that I was talking about. So without value, there's no meaning. Without meaning, there's no hope. Now, I hope you can take this away, and with whoever you get to talk to, use this. Feel free to steal it. Let's sustain the value part. I play basketball. And when I do, I like to wear, and the tragedy that just happened, it's kind of crazy, but I like to wear Kobe Bryant. Those are the shoes that feel the best, that work the best for me. If I go to the store, they may say the shoes cost $100. I say, okay, that's pretty good. That's a good deal. Now, if they said it costs $1,000, I'd be like, no. And then actually, right now, it might actually cost $1,000. But if they said that, I say, no, it's not worth that much. Because as a purchaser of a product, I am one half of the people that gets to determine and assess the value. When the creator of the product and the purchaser of the product agree, you have a transaction. We've done this thousands of times in our life. Every time you go to the store, you're like, oh, that's a good price, let me buy it. Okay, why is this important? Because only in a Christian worldview are the purchaser and the creator the same person. We've been redeemed, we've been bought back at a price. By who? By our creator. Which also means that only in a Christian worldview can we even begin to talk about inherent human value, intrinsic worth. And everybody cries, I have value as a person. You do, but you just don't know why. Give credit to whom credit is due. You do have value, but naturalism doesn't give it to you. And actually, even Dawkins has acknowledged this as well. And some atheists try to wiggle around this fact, but at least, once again, he's very antagonistic, but at least he's kind of honest with his antagonism. It is just blind, pitiless indifference, as he said. Paints a rosy picture, doesn't he? Just marching to the tune of our DNA. We're just living to die. We're just breathing to death. All right, well, let's give him a hand. Sounds good to me. But if we can objectively sustain value, because I don't care, we have a lot of self-important people in the world. But let's say you have money in your pocket. You might have a $5 or a $100 bill. It's just a piece of paper until the government gives it value. See, the way that value is assessed or determined is always, it has to be extrinsically ascribed. Nothing can give value to itself. You with me? This computer is valuable, but that's because somebody else put a price tag on it. The computer can't do that. Diamonds aren't necessarily valuable. People ascribe value to them. It's just a thing sitting in the middle of the earth. Value is always ascribed. Now, if your worldview does not provide you an ontic, transcendent source to ascribe value to you, then you don't have it. Or at least you have no way to justify it. So only a Christian worldview gives that to you. Buddhism doesn't give it to you. Hinduism, Islam, definitely not atheism. Definitely not pantheism. So now if we have an objective way to assess value, now we can get to step 2, which is meaning. The Apostle Paul, in that, my favorite passage in the Bible, or chapter, one of them is Acts 17. Shocker, I'm the apologist with likes Acts 17. But that brilliant oration Paul had on Mars Hill, he said, God who made the world and everything in it, since he's Lord of heaven and earth, he does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with man's hands, as though he needed anything. Since he gives to all life, breath, and all things, for in him we live and move and have our being. It is in the person of Jesus Christ that we have our being. It is only in the person of Jesus that we have an answer to the meaning of life. And here's why. Truth and meaning are inextricably linked. In other words, you can't know if something's meaningful until you know what's true. But only in a Christian worldview is truth not simply a concept, but a person. Only in a Christian worldview is truth not simply a concept, but a person. I was preaching in Burundi. It's a small country in Africa a couple years ago, or a few years ago, and part of my sermon was about truth. And I turned to the translator and I said, what is 1 + 1 in your country? He said 2. I was like, man, that's crazy. Because like back in Chicago, it's also 2. Truth has no boundaries. Truth is not subjective. Real truth. There is no your truth and my truth. I can't stand that. Truth is truth, regardless of who chooses to believe or not believe it. Why does this matter? Because Jesus said, I am the way, the truth. Not a version of truth, not one aspect of truth. I am the truth and the life. Which means when we have a question, we have a person to go ask. It's not an ethereal concept. When there's a question of does life have meaning, he can answer that question. When there's a question of what is the purpose in my life, he can answer that question. To encounter Christ is to encounter the truest person to ever live. And it's therefore an encounter with the source of all hope. So I talked about those 4 categories, and we are the 5th category. We are purpose-driven creatures. And this is why I get to the point where I write about relentless pursuit of purpose. But I substantiate the fact that we have purpose. It's not just, I know it's a buzzword nowadays, purpose. But God's given us value. He's provided us with meaning, and therefore he can offer us hope. That's how this properly goes. People want to jump to hope and jump to purpose, but you have to substantiate if you have value, if you're worth. Otherwise, we have no more meaning than the tree outside. So the only answer to the question, does life have meaning, that seems to suffice is found in a Christian worldview. Because in this worldview, life has meaning because we are eternally connected to the one who gives meaning to all things. So, in closing, what it means to be human is something profoundly unique, something profoundly different than what it means to be any other thing. It means that we're designed with a hidden essence that could only be provided by the source of all essence. The essential being is who is independent of all other beings, who transcends everyone and everything else, and that being, God, has paid each of us the highest compliment imaginable, and that he has created us in his very own image. And since he is intentional, since he is purposeful, why would he be any less purposeful with you or with me? Everyone has been created on purpose with a purpose.